speak about the most famous Polish philosopher, that is Plato. So, as you can see in the title, I'm going to speak about Plato's reception in Polish philosophy in the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century. The interwar period is covered in this chronological framework, and some post-war years in which the two most important Polish Plato scholars were still active, that is Wincenty Lutosławski and Władysław Witwicki. But to refer for a minute to my yesterday's lecture on Tatarkiewicz, I'll have to say something about the selection of the material, because not all of philosophical and non-philosophical phenomena that were related to Plato could be covered by my research. So, what was omitted and why? This will be the first point of my today's speech. What was omitted? The poetic and literary metamorphoses of Plato, which were deeply rooted in the Enlightenment tradition. They have not been included. It was also necessary to omit the neo-humanism and neo-Hellenism, which was associated with Vilnius. This is a great tradition, wonderful, but not philosophical. This tradition was inspired by German scholar Gottfried Ernest Grodek, who proved to be capable of instilling a passion for the ancient Greek language, for the ancient world, and also for Plato in the intellectual milieu of Vilnius. Unfortunately, his influence did not leave any continuous tradition of Hellenic studies in this area. The interests of Grodek's students in Plato, namely Józef Jerzowski and Adam Mickiewicz, were not philosophically fruitful. They considered basically Plato as a writer, a poet, an exponent of humanist ideals. Another omitted work, which sometimes in bibliographies is described by some authors as a translation of Plato's Phaedo, was also omitted, because in fact this translation is not a translation of Plato's Phaedo, but a translation of a German adaptation of Plato's Phaedo done by Jewish Prussian philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. And it was translated for the first time into Polish in 1845 and then published. There was a second edition, I'm sure about it. And in this work, Moses Mendelssohn used only the dramatic frame of Plato's dialogue to depict Socrates' death, but he, in the philosophical corpus of this text, presented his own arguments in favor of the immortality of the soul. This work played a significant role in Haskala, in Jewish Enlightenment in Poland, but it remains actually irrelevant to the reception of Plato. The history of Polish translations of the dialogues is a separate issue. Among the numerous translators who took up only single dialogue or translated more of them, one tendency was dominant, that is the tendency to translate mostly the Socratic dialogues. The reason for it is related to Socrates, to his heroism, to the moral message expressed in these dialogues, and most of these translators were mostly recruited among philologists and teachers of classical gymnasia. In Galicia, most of the time it was in Galicia. Their interest in the dialogues was primarily didactic, their goal being to introduce students to the colorful and relatively simple language of Plato's Socratic dialogues, and at the same time to draw attention of students to moral issues, basic concepts of logic, and so on. Teachers were in the gymnasia, in the Austrian gymnasia in Galicia, were the authors of numerous works published mostly in gymnasia reports, which presented detailed analysis of the dialogue structure and the structure of Socrates' arguments. Their aim was to explain philological intricacies of the Greek text, proposed corrections to the text, or provided suggestions concerning the chronology of the dialogues. All these works, however, were of minor philosophical significance. The most important and productive translator of Plato into Polish in the 19th century was Antoni Gronikowski. He was a classic teacher at the gymnasium in Ostrów Wielkopolski, at that time under Prussian rule. His translations, however, were not received enthusiastically. Unfortunately, he did not include any introduction to his translations in which he could have proved his knowledge of philosophical issues. And his translations were very difficult to read. He tried to translate every word for word. He also coined many neologisms, which were very poorly understood by the readers. So his dialogues, his translations were not read, were not well received, although he produced a dozen or even more translations of Plato's dialogues. But the readers used to, it can be read in one of the reviews of his translations that the language that Bronikowski translated from Greek, but he did not translate into Polish, he translated into Bronikowski's language. And these dialogues would require another translation from Bronikowski's language into proper Polish. So his effort was a tremendous effort, but unfortunately remained futile. Contrary to Bronikowski, Felicjan Antoni Kozłowski was the first Polish translator of the dialogues. He was not very productive, but he translated only 3 dialogues. But he wrote an introduction to his translation, and I will speak about it a little more later. Although his introduction lacked originality, deserves to be mentioned. Later translators, they were Stanisław Lisiecki and the most famous one, Władysław Witwicki, who was educated in Lwów under Kazimierz Twardowski, produced works on Plato's philosophy and commentaries which were of very good, if not excellent quality at that time. Their work went far beyond mere translation and therefore require more detailed presentation. Let's focus, so much for the selection of the material, so much for all these translators and all these researchers on Plato who were omitted. Let's say a few words about methodology. While researching the subject of the reception of Plato's dialogues, one has to be aware of the variety of issues in many fields of study that are related to the reception of Plato. Reception of literary material and the issues concerning translations of the dialogues have been left aside. The focus is centered on the philosophical aspects of the reception of Plato. The essential aim is to find such an influence of Plato on Polish thought that was as pure as possible and not diluted with other influences. So the basic aim was to research for the reception of Plato himself, of Plato only, and not the reception of diverse historical forms of Platonisms which have permeated European philosophy since the times of Plato. One of Polish philologists and historians of literature, Tadeusz Sinko, who researched ancient influences in Polish culture, he has written a very meaningful sentence on these Platonic and ancient influences in Romanticism. He says, "The main components of the wonderful scent of Romanticism were so closely interwoven with Hellenism that it is impossible to distinguish where one ends and where the other begins." But some subject is difficult, as many wise men say, but some success and some results could be achieved. And according to Tatarkiewicz, who advised historians of philosophy to make some typologies, right, to divide, to group some trends, to group some researchers, I tried to do the same, and I was able, as you can see on the handouts, to distinguish 3 stages and 3 types of Plato reception. The first stage concerns the passive reception of Platonism as a part of the wider process of the reception of contemporary philosophical currents by Polish authors, who introduced Polish philosophical milieu to the philosophy of Plato in its Kantian, Hegelian or Neo-Kantian interpretations. The second stage consists of evaluations of Plato's philosophy provided by the representatives of the different philosophical currents and philosophical approaches, who referred directly to Plato and evaluated his philosophy from their own points of view, from their own philosophical positions. Their studies on Plato had essentially no effect on the content and direction of their own philosophical research. But in the third stage involves implanting or integrating Platonic material into the tissue of Polish philosophy. The authors classified into this stage, they used Plato's dialogues to build their own philosophical views, to build their own philosophical systems. In this stage, Plato became the initial material on the basis of which they developed their own philosophical work. He became helpful and useful in the co-creation and co-production of works representing philosophical currents that originated in the 19th and 20th centuries. Sometimes Polish philosophers deeply included Plato in their own philosophical thought, thus making explanation and understanding of their own philosophical positions impossible without reference to Platonic source and inspiration. Plato's dialogues were variously processed and interpreted by these philosophers, and Platonism was integrated with their philosophies. Plato thus became one of the essential inspirations of Polish philosophical tradition, whose representatives sometimes declared the ancient pedigree of their own works. Of course, to say some words about the value of the studies on Plato, which were made 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Of course, today's experts in ancient philosophy will evaluate all or most of these studies as outdated. But it would be certainly futile to argue against them from the perspective of the 21st century, to criticize them. But what we are focused here is not the historical or philosophical truth about Plato, but the image of Plato in Polish philosophy. It has to be said that contemporary reader of Plato faces more or less the same issues, the same problems as did the authors a century ago. Though contemporary readers often fail to recognize that tradition of solving these problems is much longer and richer than is generally believed. Just like I said on my first lecture referring to Twardowski, in every philosophical culture, in every nation, what we have is much richer than we know, and we don't use our tradition because we do not have a proper knowledge about it. Okay, let's say a few words about reception. Reception as a special methodological problem in the history of philosophy. Reception studies in the history of philosophy raise doubts regarding the particular area of historical studies in philosophy to which they should be affiliated. The research on the reception of ancient philosophy in modern thought does not belong to the field of the history of ancient philosophy. Though names of Plato, Aristotle, Stoics, Socrates, and other ancient schools and philosophers appear very frequently, but this work does not belong to the historiography of ancient philosophy. It is necessary to state it clearly. Plato in Poland, the research on the reception of Plato in Poland belongs to the area of the history of Polish philosophy. And the decisive argument is the following. The texts of Polish researchers form the fundamental corpus of sources for this kind of work. The content of these texts is a complex and many-sided analysis of the essential philosophical problems, which consists of, briefly speaking, Plato and his dialogues. Therefore, despite the name of Plato in the title of such a reception study, it belongs to the history of Polish philosophy. The source material that has been subjected to the analysis is the effect of the work of Polish historians, philosophers, sometimes philologists, who confronted the problem of Plato. Platonism and the dialogues, and who used his works in their own studies, sometimes over. Oh, I got lost. Sorry. who confronted the problem of Plato, confronted the problem of Platonism and the dialogues, and who used his works in their own studies. Some of the results and conclusions may appear to be obsolete today, but obsoleces failed to touch the everlasting problems regarding Plato. So maybe the solutions are outdated, but the problems regarding the approach to Plato, the methods of reading his dialogues, and the ways of interpreting them are, if not everlasting, so still valid, I'm sure. Okay. Everyone who attempts to study a reception of philosophical work, any philosophical idea, or the image of certain philosopher in the ages-long development of European philosophy may be tempted to precede the publication of such a study with a well-known and frequently repeated maxim, habent sua fata libelli. When studying Plato's reception, another comment immediately comes to mind, namely the famous opinion about the history of philosophy which was expressed by Alfred of Whitehead, in which he referred to the history of post-Platonic philosophy as a series of footnotes to Plato. The methodological founding of the study of Plato's reception has also been aptly described by one Polish researcher of the neo-Kantian interpretation of Plato, who said, "To grasp Plato means almost to grasp the basis of philosophy in general, and one can do this in many ways. It is in fact a meeting with Plato is in fact a meeting with thinking itself, and every philosopher must constantly come through this meeting individually, for oneself and on one's own." The study of the reception of Plato must not then be reduced to the history of the impact of the chronologically distant philosopher on a number of later thinkers, but rather that every philosophical era, many philosophical trends, and many philosophers are substantially reflected in their interpretation of Plato. Their relation to Plato may be considered then as the relation to philosophy in general. Plato and his dialogues form a challenge and a task which is faced and should be constantly faced by every philosopher. The history of diverse interpretations of Plato is not just a history of reception, but it is the history of the answers to the questions which are posed by Plato and his legacy, since he is a constant source of problems and inspirations. His dialogues are still the philosopher's Bible. It should be also remembered that research into Plato's reception in modern thought is a methodologically distinct task. Reception of Kant's philosophy, of Hegel's philosophy, or of any other author by contemporary philosophers does not involve the same complications as those which are inevitable with regard to the reception of a chronologically distant ancient author, especially such an author whose name is still considered sometimes as a synonymous with philosopher. The studies which were already conducted on various phenomena on Plato's philosophical reception prove that he should rather be treated as a complex philosophical, artistic, literary, philological, and historical problem. And this complex problem was confronted by all the authors about whom I'm going to speak. Philosophers who were chronologically and intellectually closer to the examined authors were not a problem of this kind. It was not necessary to determine the basic biographical facts, nor the authenticity of their writings, and there was no need to separate the layers of myth or poetry from their philosophy. They attempted to resolve the problems that beset their contemporary readers and to express the common issues of their time. In the case of Plato's reception, the problems were attractive to his readers since they were of universal nature. This is why Plato, presented in this reception study, is not only a thinker under reception, but he is rather one of many philosophical problems which have been tackled by modern historians of philosophy and philosophers, though sometimes they have had to reach far beyond philosophy. Polish historians of philosophy have attempted to delineate a theoretical framework for reception studies in the history of philosophy. One of them was Jan Garewicz, who distinguished two layers in reception studies. The first involves merely factual reconstruction. The second layer, however, concerns the diffusion of philosophical ideas that are capable of changing global structure of thinking. This may mean only individual consciousness, when the reception of ideas of the philosopher by another philosopher is observed, but also collective consciousness. It is relatively easy to collect the factual information, which is the basis for determining the impact of Plato on Polish philosophy. Right? It's very easy to look through bibliography and see where is Plato and where his name does not appear. It is difficult, however, to point to a certain current of Polish thought or a philosophical tradition which might be in some part a result of the direct impact or simply to be a form of Platonism. Nevertheless, it is clear that the image of Plato held by the general philosophical audience has evolved, and this change can be attributed to the activity of Plato researchers. For obvious reasons, any analysis of the reception of Plato must be essentially diachronic, although its synchronous aspect comes to the fore when contemporary interpretations or contemporary images of Plato go under reception. Among the reception levels, Garewicz distinguished the following: direct references, the level of conceptual apparatus, the level of subjects undertaken and their expression, finally, the level of the main ideas. It is not argued, however, that the study of philosophical reception must be conducted on all levels. When starting the study on the reception of Plato, the first of these levels must be explored, namely the level of direct references. Attempts to examine the main ideas or concepts that have their origins in the dialogues, including the area of philosophical reflection with no direct references to Plato, would most likely turn into the overall history of European philosophy, or at least to the history of large part of this philosophy. Another historian of philosophy, Stanisław Bożen, warned against such a broad understanding of the reception phenomenon, and he provided the following example. There are some who question the original character of Bergsonism. They want to consider it as a continuation of Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism, in turn, as you know, is a reception of Platonism. Moreover, Husserl and Bergson were included among the Platonists, so both of them could simply be the followers of Plato. Considerations of this kind can really discourage one from dealing with the problem of reception. So, when there are no direct references to Plato, the reception of Plato can be turned into the general history of European philosophy. Okay, so much for this lengthy introduction. Let's go to the point. First of all, it should be noted that neither a common Polish image of Plato nor a common Polish interpretation of Platonism exists. The efforts of most researchers were scattered and they failed to create any lasting Polish school of research on Plato. Nevertheless, there were outstanding individuals who studied Plato. The relation between philosophical views of Plato's scholars and their interpretations of Plato is often mutual. For the philosophical attitude of modern authors affects their interpretation of Plato, and their reading of Plato has an impact on various dimensions of their own philosophical thinking. In particular, the mutual impact is evident in the works of the authors who are classified into the third group. Stefan Pawlicki turned Plato into a symbol of an unspoiled ancient beauty. It was sufficient to supplement Platonism with Christian thought to render the perfect essence of European culture. This is the Pawlicki's conclusion. Lutosławski considered Plato as the predecessor of his own neo-messianic philosophy. Lisiecki, expressis verbis, declared himself to be a Platonist. Witwicki deeply identified himself with his own vision of Plato as at once a scientist and an artist. Zbigniew Jordan and Benedict Bornstein recognized Plato's interests in mathematics and logic and deemed him as a distant predecessor of their own scientific research. Turning back to these three various types and stages of the reception of Plato in Polish philosophy, one must remark that the reception of Plato sometimes ran parallel to the then Western currents penetrating Polish philosophy. This happened undoubtedly in the works on Plato by Adam Ignacy Zabelewicz. His works can be considered as manifestations of Polish reception of Kantianism in the field of Platonic studies. The same applies to Kozłowski's introduction to his translations of Three Dialogues, which bears mark of Hegelianism. These studies, produced in the first half of the 19th century, are secondary and dependent on German philosophy. The merit of these authors lies, therefore, in transferring the subject of Plato's philosophy onto Polish soil. When the interest of readers in the philosophies of Kant and Hegel declined, and the anti-Hegelian trends in the second half of the 19th century arose, Zabelewicz and Kozłowski's studies of Plato no longer attracted attention. However, a closer examination of Zabelewicz's works calls for a reassessment of his reputation as an eclectic Kantian philosopher. In fact, he outlined an ambitious but unfulfilled plan for studies in the history of philosophy, which is usually neglected. The third philosopher in the first group is Władysław Tatarkiewicz, the name which is well known for us. Although he is chronologically distant from Zabelewicz and Kozłowski, he owed his interest in Plato to his influential teachers from Marburg and their interpretation of Platonism. Their neo-Kantian interpretation of Plato was for Tatarkiewicz the first and essential reference in Platonic studies, which he enthusiastically reported to Polish readers. When, 20 years after his PhD in Marburg, Tatarkiewicz started to prepare his history of philosophy, he abandoned the one-sidedness of the Marburg interpretation of Plato. The requirements of the genre of the academic handbook, History of Philosophy, resulted in a more schematic treatment of Plato in volume 1 of Tatarkiewicz's book. At the same time, it should be emphasized that Tatarkiewicz's research on Plato, on ancient thought, and on the history of philosophy in general was greatly influenced by his years spent in Marburg under the supervision of Hermann Cohen and Paul Natorp. Sometimes their influence is unfairly marginalized by the adherents of the view that Tatarkiewicz's philosophical scope and method was formed within the Warsaw School. Let us turn now to the second type of reception and to the scholars in this category. The second half of the 19th century moved the reception of Plato into another dimension, unrelated to specific philosophical currents dominating Europe, and instead confronting Plato with the views of Polish thinkers who read his dialogues and evaluated his philosophy from their own philosophical standpoint. They recognized the obvious fact that Plato was a philosopher who could not be overlooked. The significance of Plato, the strength of his influence, the crucial ethical and political questions he considered, made him a philosopher who must be referred to. Plato was then recognized as a problematic philosophical ancestor, and due to the broad scope of his philosophical output, his works started to come under a widespread and diverse reception process from criticism to enthusiasm. The main material referred to was related in the second group of researchers to ethical and political issues. The permanent reception current in Polish philosophical dispute was formed by works on Plato created by Catholic thinkers, who initially presented different approaches to Platonism, which were sometimes radically diverse. It took some time for them to develop a widely accepted framework for thinking about ancient pagan philosophy, with particular emphasis on Plato. After the initial period, as soon as Catholic authors noticed the possible accordance of Plato's philosophy with Christianity, they expressed a more balanced attitude to Plato. The most important issue for them was certainly the relation of Platonism to Christian thought. Although it proved to be difficult to reach an unanimous evaluation of Plato, a number of issues were judged positively, such as concept of innate knowledge or the belief in ethics as the purpose of philosophy in general. Plato's idea of pre-existence and his exclusion of the phenomenal world outside the area of philosophical knowledge gained a negative assessment. While some Platonic concepts underwent criticism, it was noted that they were sophisticated and spiritually close to Christianity. though they had been formed in the pre-Christian era. In this way, Christian thinkers justified their references to pagan authors. Plato, as a political thinker, inspired the socialism of Bolesław Limanowski, but at the same time, Plato was criticized as a revolutionary ideologist from the conservative position of Wojciech Dzieduszyński. A little later, at the beginning of the 20th century, Plato's political project met with the enthusiastic reception by Eugeniusz Jarra, who assessed politeia in the context of the needs of the future independent Poland. Right? He read Politeia and was thinking about it, about this dialogue, as some kind of a pattern, as a model for the future Poland. The answer to the questions about the shape of the future Polish state was sought for in Plato. He appeared to Jarra as a founder of the, maybe not a founder, but a precursor of modern democracy, which sounds paradoxical for us today. But this democracy meant for Jarra that the core of Plato's political thinking is sophocracy. Everyone who has knowledge can rule the state, right? And everyone, by everyone, he interpreted Plato in this way, that everyone meant really everyone, and the merits of every man who wanted to rule in the Republic, the merits were the only qualification. Not the birth, not parents, only intellectual merits. So he read this Plato's advice as a democratic instruction. Everyone can rule in the Republic, provided that this person is intellectually and mentally sufficiently equipped. Right? So he read it as a democratic project. A person's place in social hierarchy depended solely on this person's merits. The next stage and type of reception of Platonism in Polish philosophy, and the most significant type, begins at the turn of the 20th century. Here, mere reception and evaluation turns into transformation. Scholars of that time were familiar with Western studies on Plato, and sometimes they even influenced these studies. They assessed Plato's dialogue, but what distinguishes these scholars from their predecessors is the fact that Plato's dialogues constitute the source and the material for their own philosophies. In the encyclical Aeterni Patris, Christian philosophers found grounds and arguments for taking up studies on ancient philosophy, and their arguments wrote the following: since Thomism cannot be understood or provided with its historical explanation without Aristotle, it is necessary, therefore, to research Aristotelianism for a proper insight into the Aquinas system, right? But Aristotle himself, in turn, could be presented correctly only in the context of Plato's philosophy, right? In this way, studies on Plato were justified for Catholic philosophers. Plato is necessary to understand Aristotle, and Aristotle is necessary to understand 13th century philosophy. The most important author of this current was Stefan Pawlicki. Initially, his works devoted to Plato concerned only the biographical and historical issues. After decades in his major, though unfinished, synthetic study on the history of Greek philosophy, Plato held the most important place. And it is because of Plato that this work was left unfinished. Because Pawlicki, for almost 2 decades of his life, the final 2 decades of his life, wanted to supplement his chapter on Plato. To supplement it with new thoughts, with new literature, with new polemics, and so on and so on. So this chapter was completely unfinished, and in this form it was published after his death. The impressive development of the philosophy of Plato, as presented by Pawlicki, bears testimony to his erudition and knowledge of the subject. Numerous of Pawlicki's conclusions, especially those formulated directly as a critic of another scholar, of Lutosławski, were subsequently refuted, such as his criticism of stylometry or adherence to the chronological priority of the figures. While interpreting Plato, Pawlicki emphasized above all those of Plato's ideas which brought him close to Christian thought. This included, for example, polemic against relativism, recognition of the purposefulness of the world, the existence of its wise and good creator, the emphasis on the primacy of the spiritual realm in human nature, and the attempts to improve human beings by means of social and political change. Pawlicki did not agree to consider Plato as a socialist. Moreover, he criticized but also explained Plato for a number of issues of a dubious moral value, which were found in the dialogues, and which were difficult for Pawlicki's contemporaries to accept. Pawlicki's work is the most comprehensive, yet the most favorable, presentation of Plato's philosophy to originate in the Polish neo-scholastic movement. Due to Pawlicki's enormous enthusiasm for Plato, a decade after his death, a study was published in which its author, Victor Potempa, synthetically revised the Christian approach to Plato. He wanted to warn Christian readers from such an enthusiasm for Plato. And for him, Plato's spiritual proximity to the Christian thought was only apparent and misleading. So Pawlicki said, every Christian intellectual should read Plato to have some more intellectual background for his or her beliefs. But Potempa, a decade after Pawlicki's death, said, be careful when reading Plato, because reading Plato may lead you astray. Reading Plato may cause some errors of faith in the readers. So be careful, be careful. Oh, so much for the Christians. Maybe not for the Christian, but for the Catholic priests interpreting Plato. A separate and unique position in the history of Polish reception of Plato is occupied by Wincenty Lutosławski. He was a very influential scholar, publishing his papers in Polish as well as, or even primarily, in English and German, and also in French. Having begun his research on Plato from rudimentary historical works on the history of manuscripts, editions, and studies on Plato's dialogues, Lutosławski took up the problem of the chronology of the dialogues. He took it for international public and did it twofold. First, he proposed a complex method of linguistic statistics, and on this method he based the solution to the problem of the chronology of the dialogues. The legitimacy of the method, its assumptions and results, were internationally discussed and continue to be discussed to this very day, because this is a very exceptional case that Lutosławski's works are still referred to today, are still quoted today, and there is not one way, one approach to his legacy. Some scholars defend his results, while some say that his very method is wrong. And still, while reading English, most of the time English works on Plato, Lutosławski is there. Sometimes only in the footnotes, but he is there, which is very nice and important. Stilometry, as he called his method, was rejected by some, others accused its author of plagiarism, some scholars modified the method, and in the modified form, they used it to refute Lutosławski's chronological conclusions. But most scholars accepted its most general results. Thus, indirectly, they also confirmed the efforts of many of Lutosławski's predecessors, from whose works he had benefited. The chronology of the dialogues provided by Lutosławski was for his Western critics an autonomous and crucial issue, although for Lutosławski himself it became only the foundation of his own philosophical thought, which he founded also on Polish Romantic tradition. Plato's spiritualism in the late dialogues, as it was interpreted by Lutosławski, was an argument for the ancient roots of Polish philosophy of 19th century Polish messianism, as a spiritual outlook in particular. This confirmed the universal nature of Polish messianism, as well as the historical continuity of philosophical tradition from Plato to Polish philosophy. The only field of Plato's reception in which Lutosławski did not participate was the translation of the dialogues. His work as a whole represents an attempt to introduce Polish historians of philosophy into international discussions on Plato, but unfortunately, in this respect, he did not find creative followers in Poland. Nevertheless, he sought to transfer his passion for Plato to the next generation of researchers and to educate his successors. Other Polish scholars, Polish Plato scholars, who sometimes announced their results in Western languages, mostly in German, such as Pawlicki, did so only accidentally. The outbreak of the World War II appeared to Ludosławski to be a confirmation of his vision of Plato's philosophy as a distant ancestor of modern spiritualism, also of messianism, and finally in the 20th century of personalism, or more generally of Christianity. Plato, the philosopher who had traveled the long road from communism to idealism and spiritualism in Ludosławski's interpretation, and at the same time had in fact laid foundation for personalism and Christian thought. It was this image of Plato that appeared to Ludosławski to be a remedy for the problems of totalitarianism and communism with which Europe was at the time afflicted. Let us quickly move to the next scholar, Lisiecki. Polish audiences knew only his translation of Politeia, his studies on Plato's Phaedo, and on the concept of the pre-existence of souls. Lisiecki did not share the enthusiasm which some pre-war researchers had for Plato's political philosophy. He was disappointed by the economic conditions in the independent Poland after the World War I. And Plato's political project did not seem to him to be achievable at all. Because of his complicated biography, he lost his priest vocation and became an apostate. Lisiecki was relegated to the margins of academic life in interwar Catholic Poland, though his diligence and skills should have predestined him to take an academic position. He considered himself to be a Platonist, writing, following Cicero in this regard, that it is much better to be wrong in Plato's company than to be right together with others. It's much better to be wrong with Plato than to be right with other philosophers. Very nice phrase from Cicero. Lisiecki translated a dozen or more dialogues, but his legacy still remains in manuscript form, which is in fact regrettable. He died in, as you can see on the handout, in 1960, right? But in some Catholic dictionaries, the date of his death is printed as 1920 or 21, and this was the date when he left his priest's position, right? So they killed him in dictionaries, while he lived for over 40 years. Okay, so much for Lisiecki. Hopefully the future will pay in Poland, the debt to his work will be paid. When philosopher, psychologist, translator and artist Witwicki first began his works on Plato, his interest resulted from literary and anti-religious premises. The position of the student of Kazimierz Twardowski in Polish reception of Plato is unique because of his versatility, his influence as a translator, commentator and promoter. Witwicki's method of explaining the texts of Plato's dialogues was based on psychological analysis. He searched for the sources of Plato's concepts in his biography, in his reconstructed soul, in his type of vulnerability, and finally, in his search for the sources of Plato's philosophy in Plato's homosexuality. In the commentaries to the dialogues, Witwicki deliberately claimed that Plato's works were still up to date, and transformed Plato's works into an instrument to criticize the negative aspects of Christianity, of modern philosophy, or simply human stupidity. He compared the irrationality of religion to the rationalism of philosophy and took the side of the latter. He compared the empty verbalism of analytic philosophy of language, to the colorful philosophy which touches the most essential problems of human life, and he, of course, took the side of the latter. When criticizing Plato, Witwicki took advantage of the opportunity to express his own views on science, on ethics, on arts, and the image of Plato produced by Witwicki is primarily the image of an artist and a thinker, a poet and a philosopher, who attempted to reconcile his own conflicting aspirations and produced excellent work in terms of art and philosophy. Such an image of Plato dovetailed with Witwicki's own psyche. While talking about Plato, he was in fact incidentally talking about himself. In his occupation with Plato, Witwicki was alone or almost alone among the students of Kazimierz Twardowski, among the representatives of the entire school. They did not treat his Platonic works as belonging to the field of philosophy, but rather considered them as pieces of literary work. When Witwicki published another translation of Plato's dialogue, and he presented it as a gift to Kotarbiński or Łukasiewicz, it was Łukasiewicz. So Łukasiewicz took this book, said thank you, and put it on the works on the shelf with novels with Sherlock Holmes. Right? This was not philosophy for this analytic school of Twardowski. This was literature, and Witwicki was deeply disappointed with it. Okay, sorry for this digression. The second war proved to be an event which affected Witwicki's reading of Plato. In contrast to Lutosławski, Witwicki did not regard Plato as a remedy, but he blamed Plato for what happened in the 20th century Europe. He blamed Plato for the disasters of war and for totalitarianism. According to Witwicki, Plato was to a great extent responsible for the appearance of oppressive state institutions. Luckily for Plato, Witwicki remarked that Plato could be partly justified, since his vision of man and of society was holistic, and the institutions of Politeia were in fact a result of this vision. In post-war Poland, Witwicki observed how Platonic social and political institutions were applied. The censorship in literature and music, national unity, the attempts to control citizens' life, children's education, and so on, lacked the universal and holistic Plato's vision. What resulted was a negative effects only, and they were unable to lead to the improvement of man. It is interesting to see that the extreme experiences of war and the political conditions in post-war Poland resulted in two conflicting assessments of the philosophical and political heritage of Plato, produced by the most eminent Polish experts, Lutosławski and Witwicki. Okay, I expect that we are running out of time, so the final point, I will skip the final point, this final two names of Jordan and Borstein. I will only say that, in fact, Jordan's book can be considered, Jordan's book on Plato can be considered as some kind of a result, as a fruit of the Lvov Warsaw School of Philosophy. Right? Only he tried to analyze Plato and to prove that Plato was an inventor or a discoverer of the axiomatic method of thinking, and he was in this regard inspired by his teacher, who was the disciple of Twardowski, that is Zygmunt Zawierski. But let's keep this these two thinkers, Jordan and Borstein. Okay, so I'll quickly come to the conclusion. Conclusions in plural. Plato in Polish reception appears to be a complex of unfulfilled projects. It seems that some kind of fate weighed heavily on Platonic studies in Poland. None of his translators, neither Bronikowski, Lisiecki nor Witwicki, was able to translate all of Plato's dialogues, though all of them declared such an intention. Lisiecki, the greatest rival of Witwicki in the field of translation, was rejected by Polish academic media on non-scientific grounds, and despite his talents, hard work, and the style of his translations, which would have attracted readers today, moreover, he lost his position, right? And moreover, his lengthy monograph on Plato was destroyed by Germans during the war. And this is not the only case of, in case of Lisiecki, it was indeed destroyed and not recreated again. Because Lisiecki had a 600 pages monograph on Plato, which was written Imagine this effort. It was written by a man who was on the margins of academic life. His only income were the lessons of Latin. That was almost all. And there were not many people who wanted to learn Latin, so this was not a great money. And he wrote such a huge volume on Plato, and before the war, in the 1939, he gave this volume to Tadeusz Kotarbiński, who was going to read it and decide if this is worth publishing or not. And then a bomb hit Kotarbiński's apartment, and the book was lost. I was talking about Witwicki. There is also an interesting story with Witwicki, because he translated Plato's Politeia, Plato's Republic, and after the Warsaw Uprising, he had to move out from Warsaw. And he left this manuscript, not to take it with him, he left this manuscript in a basement of his home. And apparently, living outside Warsaw, he thought that this work had been lost. But one day, one lucky and sunny day, he received a package, and in this package there was his manuscript with a note from the burned and suffering Warsaw from a lover of Plato. This is excellent, because if this had not happened, we wouldn't have this translation by Witwicki, because he lived only until 1948. So most likely he wouldn't be able to do the translation once again. And another thing was that his eyes were, he had some eye illness, and it was really difficult for him to work. Okay, so we have this unfulfilled projects. There was one doctoral thesis on Plato which was defended under supervision of Lutosławski. This thesis was defended in Vilnius by Benedict Wojczyński, and this proved to be his swan song, unfortunately. It was meant to be just a starting point for his subsequent Platonic studies, but unfortunately 2 years after this PhD thesis, Wojczyński died, and nothing came out of it. Pawlicki was unable to complete his synthetic work on Greek philosophy, as I said. Jarra, as well, who assessed Plato as a democrat, having written his PhD, promised to conduct further research on this subject. But after the First War, he took a position at the Faculty of Law at the University of Warsaw, and he never returned to Plato again. About Jordan and Borstein, this is completely another story. Jordan as well wanted to continue his research on Plato, but after the war, he stayed on the exile in Great Britain, and he observed that there is not much interest in his works on Plato, but there is a great interest in Marxism. So he started to write in English on Marxism, and this is how he earned money for his living. Okay, finally, this is just final paragraph. Finally, it is worth asking another question. Is the above review of Polish works on Plato over a period of 1.5 centuries helpful in understanding Plato better? The answer to this question will not be unambiguous. It is impossible to expect the reader at the beginning of the 21st century to accept any of the presented images of Plato as the ultimate solutions or final answers. At the same time, contemporary scholars may find in this review a reflection of current discussions on the approach to Plato's philosophy and on the methods of reading them. The history of Plato in Poland may be useful in determining the place of today's researchers within the context of the Polish history of studies on Plato, and maybe it may be also useful to apply some of these reception solutions to other philosophers. Thank you very much.
Should I manage once again? So, if you have questions.
I'll have a short drink.
So while you are drinking, questions?
Thank you for an excellent lecture. My question is, you elaborated is finished in 1980s. So what happens to Plato's reception today? What is the situation about Plato in Poland now? Is he popular, and how is it today? For struggle, you can feel some issue between analytic philosophers that try to read Plato through the point of to read Plato only if he posed some questions that are important today, and the contemporary philosophers they just try to get historical, cultural, and social conditions of Plato, his own time. So is there this struggle, can you feel this struggle in European universities, in Polish universities, about Plato today? It's also quite...
Certainly there is a struggle, a kind of strife, conflict, and dispute maybe. But what is the point of this dispute? I would say that the point lies in various methods of approaching Plato. And I can recall disputes which are held during the symposia of International Plato Society, or the disputes which are held in Poland between those who prefer to read Plato at first literary, to read his dialogues are masterpieces of literature, of ancient Greek literature, and between those who try to put Plato's arguments into logical symbols, right? These are the two opposite ways of reading and approaching Plato. And certainly, today's Plato scholarship is very often focused on very tiny issues, sometimes on philological small problems which are of no importance for philosophers. But philosophers as well, especially in politics, as you mentioned. Plato is most of the time read as someone who had substantial and valid arguments against democracy. And these arguments, in a little bit transformed way, but they are still repeated today. This is what we can see in Poland. The field of reception of Plato after the 50s is an interesting issue. First of all, what should be done? A reception among Marxist philosophers, who was not really researched profoundly, but, well, I don't have to tell you how the Marxist philosopher, what the Marxist approach to Plato basically can be. And what is very good for Plato, not only in Poland, but as far as I know, in the rest of the world, but still new translations appear. Sometimes it seems that the translations that we have are sufficient, that they are good, but there is always some area for improvements. And the new translations appear. Some of them are better, some of them are a step, go back, let's say, that they go back into the 19th century in their ways of translating, but still this is good to have many ways of interpreting Plato and to read his works in modern European languages.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question. What is the situation on the study on Neoplatonism in Polish? Because I know that in Russia, Russian Federation, in many books on Neoplatonic tradition now and translation and original text, and I'm interested in what situation in Polish.
So Polish research on Neoplatonism, certainly there is something like this, like Polish research on Neoplatonism. First of all, we have, as for Plotinus, we have a little bit outdated translation, which is sometimes misleading, but I'm sure that this issue will be solved within some of the following years. The studies on the reception of minor Neoplatonists is also pursued, but I'm not sure if I can be the right person to say something about the effects of these studies. But this is very good that this study is done. So as far as I can say, the Neoplatonism now receives its multidimensional phase. Right? It's not limited only to the central figures, but it's also broadening its scope onto the other Neoplatonist philosophers.
Thank you.
I know it's the same as asking about favorite child, but nevertheless, do you have your favorite dialect text of Plato? It's my first question. And second one, do you have some advice, possibly strategy for students, how to read Plato, from what should they start? From apology or Menon, for example? I don't know. Please.
Okay. My favorite well, maybe there is one dialogue which is very useful for the beginning. I mentioned, when I talked about Witwicki, I mentioned that Plato was one of his inspirations for his anti-religious sentiments. Because Euthyphro, well, the Euthyphro will be this dialogue. Euthyphro is a dialogue which was read in the gymnasia to teach students Greek language. This was the source text, right? And in this text, we can see how Socrates is talking to the, what would be the right word to replace priest? Priest? Help. Okay, so I will call him priest, but you know what I'm talking about, right? This is the priest of Greek religion, right?
Священник, priest, жрец.
No, kapłan. Okay, so Euthyphro. Let's call him.
Є священнослужитель у нас.
Which style?
Euthyphro. Okay, so never mind.
Ні, зараз
Learn still sacrifice.
Sacrifice.
Yeah.
Okay. So priest is short. I will be priest.
жрець, священнослужитель.
Nothing comes to my mind. I know I had this word some time ago, but okay, so let's make him a priest. So Socrates discusses with him very important issues, and the discussion is pursued in a very humorous form. And the humor of Socrates in this dialogue is wonderful, because the Euthyphro was presented as some kind of a person who is a believer who cannot recognize the contradictions of religion. A believer who cannot think rationally about the religion. And every rational attempt to examine his beliefs makes him feel stupid, let's say stupid. And finally, he runs from Socrates, right? He says, I'm sorry, I have to go, I have no time, we'll talk about it later, right? But the later never comes. So, Euthyphro is the dialogue which I would recommend as the beginning. And when Witwicki read this dialogue, he applied some arguments to the priest who was teaching Catholic religion in his gymnasium. And unfortunately, Witwicki's views were not in favor of religion, and he, until his old days, was the opponent of religious thinking. And his personal tragedy was that his sister was a nun. His sister was a nun, and he was the head of one of the Galician orders. I can't remember what is the name of this order. It originated in France, and they had such large cornets. Okay. And his sister wrote him letters. My dear brother, stop commenting Plato in this way. I beg you, don't do this anymore. And his answer was, if you ask me to cut off my finger and send it to you, I'll be glad to do this. But never ask me not to translate comments about Plato. So I would recommend you Tiflo for the beginning. There are many philosophical issues there. There are some logical issues. There are some certainly religious issues. Where we have in this dialogue this problem of paradox of Euthyphro. Although also Euthyphro was used by Catholic thinkers for some time to prove that polytheism is wrong. That you can avoid many irrational content in religion if you abandon polytheism. So, Euthyphro is my first choice.
A lot of questions, but what, on your opinion, is a specific type of Polish reception of Plato? And the second question is, when do you recommend studying Plato, and how? For example, only in Greek, in all the Greek language, or on the basis of translation texts, because, for example, we haven't got enough base of Latin and all Greek language quality for understanding dialogue, early dialogue of Plato or other type of work. When do you recommend studying Plato as a philosopher?
So as for the first question, the specific type, there was not any school of Polish interpretations of Plato, but I would point to Lutosławski. I would point to Lutosławski because his attempt to interpret Plato was deeply rooted in Polish messianism. So if Polish 19th century messianism is a kind of Polish philosophy, so Lutosławski attempted to prove that messianism was rooted in Platonism, of course in his own interpretation. So this proved, and this was very important for him, this proved that messianism is not a philosophy of some exotic nations, on some exotic nation on the margins of Europe, but that this is Polish philosophy, not Hegelianism, not French philosophy, that is in fact the hair of this old ancient tradition. Well, if we wanted to assess his arguments today, we can show how he sometimes misread some of Plato's texts. If he misread it intentionally or not, this could be disputed. But I like the idea that Lutosławski's interpretation of Plato is in fact Polish because it is rooted in 19th century philosophy. Just like the Neo-Kantian interpretation of Plato is somewhat rooted in German tradition because it's rooted in Kant, right? While American interpretations of Plato of the same time, of the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, is rooted in American tradition because they draw much of the substance in interpreting Plato from American transcendentalists. And for the second question, when or where to start reading Plato? Of course, reading Plato in Greek is very difficult, and reading Plato in Greek, as the first attempt of reading Plato, I think could be very, very discouraging. I've read memories of one professor, Professor Domański from Warsaw, he is probably the only living Polish philosopher whose first contact with Plato was a contact by the Greek text. The first contact by the Greek text. Why? Because in the years right after the war, he was unable to find in the libraries any of the Witwicki's translation. So, since he knew Greek, it was easier for him to take the Greek text. But all the other philosophers, including me, including my colleagues, and also the older generations of philosophers and historians, we most of the time start reading Plato with Witwicki. This has some advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that Witwicki's language is very vivid, that he was able to retrieve Plato's humor, that he was able to present, to turn this Greek text into a spoken Polish language. Of course, some said that there are some Lviv characteristics of language. Or maybe some people from the mountains speak like this, like Witwicki's Socrates. But this is possible. But on the other hand, I have to say that the dialogues in Witwicki's interpretation are very... this is an artistic experience to read them. Maybe when he, or maybe not maybe, but almost for sure, when he translated the late dialogues of Plato, he didn't have much sympathy for them. And you can see it in the translation. So, early dialogues of Plato are great, are masterpieces of humor. But the late dialogues for him, it was like chewing someone else's food once again. Reading the Parmenides and translating Parmenides, for example, was for him a hard piece of job. So he did not enjoy this task very much. But to do research on Plato, you have to, if not only read it in Greek, so you have to know at least some basics of Greek, to know the basic ideas, the basic concepts, and so on and so on. But to profit from reading Plato, and in this regard, I adhere to the American intellectuals and scholars. They said that to benefit from Plato, you don't need commentaries. You don't need to know Greek. You just need a good translation. And when you read Apology, when you read the Euthyphro, when you read the Republic, in good translation, this will improve the reader as a human being. This will be to the moral and intellectual benefit. And such a reading of Plato's dialogue, not for academic purposes, is also okay. Is also fruitful.
Thank you.
One more question. Yes, please.
One of part of your lecture is about little, maybe small part, about something special what we have in our contemporary society, and maybe we can say about Plato in the post-genderism context. For example, Don Haraway, who is a professor in University in California, and she has a text, Keyboard Manifesta. It's about, maybe if we interpret it, it's Plato's androgynes, yes? And what is contemporary context and interpretation, maybe is in Polish historian and philosophy, this problem, because it's Europe, and now we have such a interesting time, maybe, and it's actual for us to interpret something, because these philosophers forget about Plato when they say about their feminist studies or something like that.
Okay. So the first question should be, was Plato a feminist? Was he a feminist? Well, there is some gender equality in Plato, right? When Socrates speaks about the in the Republic, when he speaks about the education of young boys, he, from time to time, he asks, but what we say about boys right now also regards the girls. Remember this, that this also regards the girls. So, there is some kind of gender equality in Plato. Witwicki, who was to some extent who raised the issue of Plato homosexuality, he said that Plato was in favor of feminism or of gender equality because he did not have any love for women. Right? So he could be a feminist in this way. But as for more modern readings of Plato in this regard, I think that I cannot be of much help. I know that there are many readings of Plato. I can't tell you the name of the author, but there is a reading of Plato's cave. That Plato's cave is a metaphor of a womb. And every man who goes out of the womb dreams to return to the safe place again. And this is the reading of the path of a philosopher who goes out of the cave and wants to return back. I don't remember the name of this philosopher. This is some feminist philosopher. I have it somewhere, but no, not right now. So there are many various readings of Plato. And, well, why not? Why not? Juliusz Domański, whom I mentioned, wrote a very short piece which I especially like, on the users of ancient legacy and on the historians of ancient legacy. Well, if we split everyone who reads Plato into one of these two categories, so it will be very easy. If you are a historian of Plato's philosophy, you try your best to find the background, to explain his ideas, to read, to present them to the readers. If you're a user, you're free to do almost all that you want to do, which is sometimes even against the text itself.
Last short.
Okay. But the answer can be long. Unlimited.
It is, as for me, very important to remember about Karl Popper, his work, Open Society, and his its enemy, Plato, as an enemy of open society. What do you think about the youth of Popper?
I cannot reveal my position, but I can reveal positions of others. Well, if you examine Popper's footnotes, I start with the least important remark. If you look at Popper's footnotes, you will find there who? Lutosławski. Because Popper says that he had to accept some kind of chronology of the dialogues, and he decided to accept Lutosławski's chronology of the dialogues. But what about the idea of Plato as someone who defends the closed society, right? Well, Popper's book aroused much opponents, who were most of the time philologists. And there are many volumes, maybe not many, but I know 3 or 4 books who were written to defend Plato from Popper. Some of them, there was a scholar in New England at the University of Maine whose name was Ronald or Donald Levinson, and he wrote a fat volume in defense of Plato, in which he shows where Popper went wrong, where he did wrong, what was an over-interpretation interpretation or misinterpretation of Plato's thought. But Popper's work was published, the first edition was published in 1945, if I'm not mistaken. And what is interesting in Polish context is that this work had 2 or 3 readers in Poland at that time. Witwicki's assessment of Plato after the Second War is very similar to that of Popper, although his argumentation was not so detailed and so on and so on. It was rather a general view of Plato, who should be blamed for totalitarianism in Europe. And Polish academic publishing house in the 50s decided to publish Popper's work, and this work was translated into Polish, but when they read it they decided definitely not to publish it, right? Especially volume 2, who was devoted to Marx, right? But this work, Open Society, was published in Polish in the 80s for the first time. In the 80s for the first time by the underground publishers. Yes, and the story is somewhat unclear to me, because I've read somewhere that it was confiscated, but only some volumes appeared on this underground reading market. I am glad to have these volumes. And I'm not sure how this story ended, but the translator of the Popper, who was a woman, she hid herself under the male pseudonym, under the male name, not to reveal her identity. But only after the 1981, Popper's work was published again, legally, in full, and her name was revealed at that time. So, and what is my opinion? Popper's interpretation is not unsubstantiated. It's not fully but this is all. But we don't have the time for this. This is always like this. Yes, but.
Yes, but.
Yes, to some extent, and it requires further explanation. Thank you.
We have to thank you so much.
Well,